Go ahead and dive into tonight's passage. If you remember, we have been in the letter of 1 Corinthians, which is actually Paul's second letter that he wrote to the Corinthians. We don't have access to the first letter Paul wrote. This is actually 2 Corinthians technically, and 2 Corinthians in our Bible is technically 4 Corinthians. So we're about halfway through the letter of 1 Corinthians. If you remember from last week, if you weren't here, that's okay. Paul began to address a new issue. The Corinthians had all of these questions about food that's been sacrificed to idol statues. And I know that is something that you all struggle with on a daily basis. You know, you see some cereal that's been sacrificed to Vishnu, it's half off, should you buy it, should you not buy it? It's great. You guys deal with that every day, I am sure. Now, obviously, we don't deal with that. That's not our issue. Just a little bit of context to set up what's going on in this passage. The Corinthians were formerly pagans who used to participate in these pagan ceremonies, sacrificing meat to pagan gods, who were represented by these idol statues in the gods' temple. So the Corinthians, they start following Jesus. Paul comes, we believe 80, 50, preaches the gospel. A bunch of people give their allegiance to Jesus, about 50 to 100 people. And then they start following Jesus. They temporarily stop going to the temples. They stop participating in these ceremonies, in these pagan feasts. But now they're back in the temples. They're participating in idolatry because they think they have the right to do so. Now, these chapters 8, 9, and 10, are all about rights, what you and I can and cannot do. Now, the Greek word for rights that's used in this passage is exousia. Can you guys say exousia? Exousia, yeah. And exousia is also translated in these passages as authority. So anytime you see the word authority or rights, it's the same Greek word exousia. That's going to be important. Now, here's the point. The Corinthians are obsessed. They're consumed with this question, what do we have the authority to do? What's our rights? What can we and can we not do? And Paul says that is all backwards. We should not be so concerned with our rights and our freedoms, but we should be concerned with love. What's good for our siblings in Jesus? It's not about what I can and can't do. That's not the right question. Can I do this? Can I not do this? The right question is this good? Does this lead to life for my siblings in Jesus? The Corinthians, they were going around saying, oh, hey, the gods aren't real. The gods we used to worship aren't real. So this meal that we're eating won't hurt us, right? Like, we can do it, and you guys should do it too. And Paul is saying, you guys are actually wrong. You guys are wrong. The gods are real. If you've read through your Bible, you know the gods are real. The Bible just assumes they are real. And what the gods are spiritual beings in rebellion against God and stealing worship from him, enslaving the nations through idolatry. The gods are very real. And what they are spiritual beings, God's heavenly staff team that went rogue and they're in rebellion against God. And so the point is, this is idolatry. Participating in these pagan feasts and these ceremonies, that actually is idolatry. These gods are real. You are performing idolatry. It will hurt you. So stop, Paul said last week, stop sinning against Jesus by dragging his people, your siblings, back into sin, back into idolatry. And Paul ended last week's passage by saying it's not about our rights, but it's about giving up our rights for the sake of love, to protect our brother or our sister in Jesus from stumbling. And so now he's going to use himself as an example. The Corinthians have been challenging Paul's status as an apostle for a couple reasons. One reason is that Paul refuses to take payment from the Corinthians. And that's weird to them. They wonder, is he a legit apostle? He doesn't receive payment from us. We're trying to pay him money, and he will not take it. They think that's weird. In Paul's world, the primary form of entertainment, they didn't have media or cinema, so the primary form of entertainment was going to hear a traveling preacher or teacher or philosopher, and you would pay them to lecture you about how to live the good life. You would pay them so they could teach you how to become wealthy. It's like, oh, okay, there's people like that today. Yeah, like how to be happy and how to be wealthy. Pay me money and I'll tell you how. Now, Paul is an intellectual. He is just like these philosophers. He has a message that he claims is the best news ever. And yet, instead of being paid for it, and living off of that, he refuses to accept their money. Instead, he prefers to work with his hands. He works in a trade, tent making, and he does that to make ends meet. And that would have been considered shameful. Remember Corinth, the city of Corinth, situated in an honor-shame society. Not many places like that anymore today. Lots of parts of Southeast Asia are still like this. Everything is about gaining honor in these societies, and it's about avoiding shame at all costs. And working for a trade was considered shameful. The people with the most honor were the people who didn't have to go so low. They were people like the speakers, the teachers, the athletes. They didn't have to work for a trade. They can make their money other ways. So Paul, here's the point. He has every opportunity to make his living from this preaching gig, but he doesn't do that. And why is that? The Corinthians begin to think, and they begin to say, Paul, do you even have the authority? Do you have the right for payment? Like, you don't want to take it from us. Do you even have the right to receive payment from us? We have supported other traveling teachers from the way of Jesus. We supported, like, even other apostles like Peter and James. We've sent them money as they've gone on their way. Could it be, Paul, that you're not actually an apostle? So Paul asked the question, starting in verse 1, am I not free? Am I not an apostle? Have I not seen the risen Lord? Again, these are all rhetorical questions. Every answer to these few questions at the beginning is meant to be yes. Paul is an apostle. He is an apostolos. Can you guys say apostolos? That is a Greek word that means a sent one. Paul was he has personally seen the risen Jesus, and he has been personally commissioned by the risen Jesus to do what? To go preach the gospel, the royal announcement that Jesus is king, to preach that gospel where it has not yet been preached, and to plant churches. Paul is an apostle, commissioned by the risen Jesus. Jesus sent him out to do what? To preach the gospel where it has not been preached and to plant churches. That's Paul's mission. Jesus gave it to him personally. And the Corinthians are saying, hey, Paul, show us some proof that you are an apostle. Now, you guys probably lost. I know, I was lost when I read this. Like, what does that have to do with meat sacrifice to idols? What does that have to do with my life? It has everything to do with your life. I promise. Just wait till towards the end. It will all make sense in a few minutes. I promise you that. So, Paul is saying to them, hey, listen, you guys are asking me for proof that I'm an apostle. You guys are the proof. Like, I started this church. I shared the good news with you people. Other people may question my apostleship. Some may say that I'm not an apostle, but at the very least I am to you. I started this church. Y'all are the seal of my apostleship in the King. Translation, you are the authentication that my status as an apostle is legit. It would be like me saying to my dad, like going up to my dad, who's my biological dad, and saying to my dad, are you sure, Dad, you've ever had kids? You know what I mean? Like, dude, like, duh, I am his child. You know, like, Dad, if that's your real name. Like, you know what I mean? That'd be so messed up. Like, duh, how dare I, his child, say to him, have you ever had children? Like, so this is Paul's defense against those who are examining him. He says this, don't we have a right to eat and drink, or the right to marry a believing wife, as do the other apostles, or Jesus' half-brothers, or Cephas, that's Peter? Or is it only Barnabas and I who have to work for a living? So this is Paul's point. Don't get lost here. Paul is saying, I have the right to receive financial support from y'all. Y'all should be supplying my most basic needs. You should be supplying money for food and for drink. Paul is single at this point. But if Paul had a wife, she would also have the right to their support, to provide for her basic needs. And really, all church leaders have that right. All church leaders have the right to not work for a living and make the gospel, the royal proclamation about the risen king, that is their living. Every church leader has the right to make that their living, the gospel their living. That is 100% acceptable. And even Paul, this is so interesting, even Paul uses this right. Like, if you go read other letters of Paul receives financial support from multiple churches. He'll take money from multiple churches, just not this church, just not Corinth. That's the one church Paul's like, I'm not going to receive money from you. Other churches, yeah, I'll receive their money. I'll make the gospel my living when I'm there in those churches serving them, but not y'all. And we'll get to the why in a second. But make no mistake, Paul is saying, I very much have the right to receive financial support from y'all. He asked a few questions, basic examples from just human life, everyday life. Do soldiers serve at their own expense? Well, no, of course not. Soldiers don't have to provide their own guns. You know, if there's a battle going on, they don't look at the soldiers and say, hey, where's your tank? Like, where's your tank? You're supposed to bring a tank to the battle. No, that's ridiculous. Or when you plant a vineyard, Paul says, you will absolutely enjoy the fruit of your labors. Like, literally, pun intended. You will enjoy the fruit of your labors if you plant a vineyard. Let's say you tend a flock. Let's say you are like actively milking goats every single day. You're probably going to drink that milk. Probably. Like, you milk that goat, you're probably going to drink that milk. These are all just basic human examples based on human authority. So now here's a question people might ask is, okay, what about divine authority? What about divine examples? Like, this is how humans operate, this is how humans understand these things, but is this how God operates? Does God agree with that setup? Does God agree that people working should then enjoy what they produce? Does God agree with that? Well, apparently, yes. God definitely agrees with that. God definitely agrees with that. Paul then quotes the Torah. Specifically, he quotes Deuteronomy chapter 25, verse 4. Don't muzzle an ox while it's treading grain for you. It's working really hard, the ox is. It wants to occasionally bend down and eat some food as it's working. Preventing an ox from doing so would be considered animal cruelty. And God apparently is not down with animal cruelty. Now, Paul asks, does God care about the oxen? Well, Well, sure, of course God cares about the oxen. But why was this law written? Why was it written, don't muzzle an ox while it's treading grain? Why was that law written? Paul says that law was written for our sake. It was written for us. Now, the original context of the law is about oxen, for sure. But the wisdom behind the law is for humans. Israel, this is really interesting and important, Israel did not have what you and I would call a statutory law system, like what you and I have today, where you and I basically when we break a law, we go to the court, we go to the judge, they pull out a law book, and then they look up that law, and then they enforce that law to the letter. They didn't have that back then. That's a statutory law system. That's what you and I have today. They did not have that in the ancient world. They had something called a common law system. And in a common law system, you would assume an ideal principle. Like an ideal principle is just assumed. So like justice, righteousness, goodness. And then these laws, the laws you find in the first 5 books of the Bible, these laws are examples of that ideal being played out in a specific context. Does that make sense? So you just assume an ideal, and how's that ideal play out in a certain context? That's what the law is for. It's an example of that. That's why if you read through your Bible, let's say you took the laws from the book of Exodus, and you put them side by side with the laws of Deuteronomy, you might be quickly disturbed. You might be like, whoa, these totally contradict. The way God talks here in Exodus and what he says to do is very different than what he says to do over here in Deuteronomy. He's contradicting himself. Like in Exodus, he says, don't boil the Passover. In Deuteronomy, he says, boil the Passover. And you're like, which is it? And it's the same thing. Except over here, context, they're going into the wilderness. Over here, context, they're going into the land. Does that make sense? So depending upon the context, the law is going to look a little bit different. But the ideal, the principle, that's the point. So take the principle behind the law. And what's the law? Do not muzzle an ox while it's treading grain. Take the principle behind that and apply that principle to Paul's situation, to Paul's context. And what do you get? You get this. Churches, Paul says, should support their leaders financially. They should. That is perfectly acceptable. The plowman, Paul says, should plow in hope, and the thresher thresh in hope of sharing in the crop. Paul says, listen, me and Barnabas, we have sown spiritual things among you. We brought the gospel, and through believing the gospel, y'all gave your allegiance to Jesus. You received his spirit. So if we have sown spiritual things among you, should we not reap material things from you? Like if we've done all this, and also, here's the thing, he says, and if you've done that for others, if you've supported them financially, shouldn't you do that all for us, all the more? We started this church. We gave you the gospel. We gave you the gospel by which you received God's Spirit. If you've done all this stuff for other people, supported their ministry, should you not do that all the more for us and provide for our needs? But, Paul says, and this is important, we're starting to get where you guys come into this, but Paul says, we have not made use of this right. It is our right. It is our exousia. It's our authority, but we haven't made use of it. Now, this is really important. Again, I mentioned this a second ago. Paul does make use of this right when he's in other places, when he's serving other churches. He receives pay. The gospel is his living in certain churches that he works in, but not in Corinth. Whenever he's in Corinth, he refuses to receive payment from them. Apparently, doing so would, in Paul's own words, put an obstacle in the way of the gospel moving forward. And Paul, his single passion in life, the thing that everything else is about for him, and I think arguably what everything else should be about for us, is the gospel. Everything's about the gospel. How I raise my kids, how I do marriage. It's all about how I do my vocation, my job. It's all about the progress of the gospel. Paul says, I will endure anything, even hard manual labor, if it means that the gospel will go forth without anything preventing its progress. But again, Paul says, this is my right. If I wanted to receive payment from you, that would not be sinful. That'd be perfectly acceptable. Those employed in temples, Paul says, whether Jewish temple or the pagan temples, they get their food from the temple. Again, what's the main issue Paul is addressing in these chapters? Meat sacrificed to idols in idols' temples. Those who serve at the altar get their daily provision from the offerings. So like if you go make a sacrifice to one of these demons, one of these spiritual beings, it gets sacrificed to the god, but who eats it? The priest. The priest eats it. In the same way, Paul says, he brings up Jesus, because Jesus is the authority. Jesus commands that those who proclaim the good news should get their living by the good news. This is a command straight from the lips of Jesus in Luke chapter 10, verse 7. The laborer deserves his wages. But, Paul says, I have made no use of any of these rights. And Paul says very clearly, and listen, and I'm not writing this so that you guys will start paying for my food and drink. I'm not writing this so you guys will start paying for my stuff and writing my check. I don't want your money. Paul says, I would rather die than... He stops. In our Bible, it continues. In your English Bibles, it continues. But in the original Greek, it actually ends there mid-sentence. It just says, I would rather die than, it just stops. Paul would rather die than what? He doesn't say. He continues. He says, no one will nullify my boast. And what does that even mean? No one will be able to take away my ability to boast. You're like, oh, what's that mean? About what? What is Paul's boast? And listen, this is really important. Paul is boasting about something. It is not that he is preaching the gospel. He says this, if I preach the gospel, there is no grounds for boasting. You don't get to brag if you're preaching the gospel and people are being saved. Like, I'm just doing exactly what I've been told to do, right? You don't get to brag about doing something that you were just told to do. Like, Jesus commissioned me. This is my destiny. I am just doing the thing I was told to do. I don't get to brag about doing what I was told to do. It's like, I talk to a lot of young dads, and some of the young dads that I've talked to, some of them, they want a pat on the back for just providing, just doing the thing they should be doing anyway. You know what I mean? Like, you just want to say to them, like, yeah, good job. You did the bare minimum. Like, you did the bare minimum. You're so proud of you. And listen, I get it. Like, I'm a dad. I get it. I'm like that too. Even the bare minimum is really hard work. And so is the gospel. So is the gospel. And not only Paul, he says, this is really important, not only Paul, but listen, all of us are called to preach. Every single follower of Jesus is called to preach. The Greek word means to proclaim something. This is not for professionals or apostles or pastors. This is something for every single one of you. If you claim to follow Jesus, then you are called by Jesus to preach the gospel. We are all to share the good news of Jesus with others. But here's the thing. Listen, if we do that, and if we do that faithfully, we don't get to brag about it because all we did was the thing we were commanded to do. Don't brag because you did what was expected of you. Paul says, necessity is laid upon us. Necessity, Paul says, is laid upon me. And I would add, on all of us. He says, woe to us, woe to me if I do not preach the good news. God's judgment be on me. The word woe there is a judgment word. It means God will judge us. His judgment will be on you if you do not preach the good news. That's what the word woe means. But you guys, God's going to judge you. I don't know if you know that. Follower of Jesus, you will not be punished by God. All your punishment has already been meted out. You will not be punished by God, not at all. There's no condemnation. But you will be judged by God. You and I will be judged by God, whether or not we did the thing that he told us to do. And Paul says, listen, if we do these things in our own will, then we have a reward. Oh yeah, sorry, Calista, I didn't see you. Yeah, sure, yeah. Punish means retribution for evil. Judge, or judgment, the Hebrew word's mishpat, it just means judgment or justice is doing certain actions that bring about right relationship. Justice leads to righteousness. It's doing things that lead to shalom and peace and harmony. So that includes punishing evil, but it also includes restoring balance. It includes harmony. It includes evaluating that which is good and throwing out that which is evil. Does that make sense? And so for God to judge us, it means, we looked at this a few chapters ago in chapter 3, when he judges, like, let's say a church leader's work, he looks at what they did, and it goes through a fire. That's judgment. And on the other side of that fire, what lasted, what was on the other side of that fire, what they did, and what they built with the right materials. What their church wasn't built on things like entertainment or just being funny, whatever. Like the stuff that lasts, they get a reward for that. But the stuff that doesn't last, it'll be burnt up because it wasn't built with the right materials. So judgment is evaluating that which is good, and it's removing that which is bad. Or does that make sense? Kind of. Yeah, sure. Yes, the consequence. Yes, and we're going to get to that in a second. The consequence, and I'll just give you a little preview. The consequence is a recognition that you could have been rewarded and you don't get rewarded. You don't get rewarded. And what you did is burnt up. What you did is burnt up. You're still saved, Paul says. He's talking to church leaders in chapter 3. You're still saved, even by fire, Paul says. Like just in the nick of time, you're snatched out of it, but everything you did crumbles. And you watch it crumble. And you watch it just, you know what I mean? And that's judgment. It's not punishment because you're not going to hell. You're not being punished by God. Jesus took your condemnation on your behalf. You don't have to suffer for any of your sins. But the things you did, because the thing is, we're saved by grace, but we are judged by our works. The Bible's very clear about that. The New Testament's very clear about that. We're not punished for our works, but we are judged by our works. Does that make sense? Kind of? Yeah, here, how about this? I'm going to keep reading this part. We're going to get to rewards and judgment in just a second. If it's not clear by the end of it, bring me back to it. If it's not clear by the end. So, great question, though. Wonderful question. But that's a really important concept. Judgment in the Bible is not just about retribution, punishment of evil. Justice in the Bible is restorative. Justice is about restoring peace and harmony and shalom. That is judgment in the Bible. When God brings justice, it's a good thing. It's not just him destroying the evildoers, it's him rescuing, bringing salvation to the righteous. That's judgment. Does that make sense? So let's keep going for just a second. So Paul says this, if we do things of our own will, like if we just choose to do things and we just do it of our own free will, we will have a reward for the things that we do. But in this case, we are not just doing things of our own will. We're not. We've been told to do it. Like this, you didn't just do this of your own will. I didn't choose to preach the gospel. I am simply obeying something I have been tasked with. It isn't my will, it's God's will. And I can't brag and say, oh, look at all the stuff I did for you, Jesus. It's like, I just did the stuff he told me to do. I just did the stuff he told me to do. So Paul says, listen, even if I didn't choose this, like, I don't preach the gospel just because I want to. Even then, because I didn't choose this, it chose me, for lack of better words, even then, I've still been entrusted with a stewardship. The word stewardship there in the original Greek is oikonomos. It's describing the top-ranking slave, the household manager. The master has entrusted me, Paul says, with his stuff. And that's true for every single one of us. You are all oikonomos. You are the top-ranking slave in God's household, and he has entrusted you. The master has entrusted you with his stuff. And on the day Jesus comes back, he's going to look at every single one of you. The Bible says he's going to look at every single one of us, and he's going to say to all of you, what did you do with my stuff? My stuff, not your stuff. I don't own anything. I don't own anything. And he's going to look at me, and he's going to say, what did you do with my stuff? He's going to say it to every single one of us. That's true for every one of us. So here's the point. Here's what Paul's asking then. So, logically, if I'm just doing my job, then what then? Do I still get a reward? Like, if I'm just doing the thing I'm supposed to do I still get rewarded at the end of this? And apparently Paul says, yes, you still do get a reward. And what is Paul's reward? Now, this is really important. There's a word play here in Greek. This is so cool. It says this, my payment is that in preaching the gospel, I may present it without payment. That's what it says in Greek. My reward, my payment, is that in preaching the good news, I may present it to others without payment. That's my payment. Giving away the good news for no pay. And not making a full use of my right, of my authority in the gospel. I could make a full use of my right, but I'm not going to, Paul says, because that way I could present the gospel without payment, and that is my payment. That is my boast. I would rather die, Paul says, than anyone take that away from me. Because the gospel is about freedom. It's about God's free gift of freedom, and this message is for free. But again, this is probably where you're probably thinking to yourself, if you're a Bible nerd, you probably know, but wait, Paul did receive payment from other churches. When he went to other churches, he received payment from them. So what the heck, Paul? Like, why not Corinth? Why, when you're in Corinth, you won't receive payment from them? What's the problem? Here's why. Here's why I think Paul refused to receive payment from them. The Corinthians are used to traveling speakers who ask for money. And if Paul was to receive payment from them, then someone or anyone could accuse Paul of being in it for the money. Does that make sense? They're used to seeing all these speakers come around asking for money when they speak. And if Paul was to receive money from them, anyone could look at Paul and say, hey, you did it for the money. That guy did it for the money. And Paul is not going to let that happen because that could prevent the gospel from going forward. If someone just looked at Billy and accused me and just said, hey, you're in this for the money, that could potentially prevent the gospel from going forward. Everything we do, Paul says, should be about the progress of the gospel. I will endure anything. I will gladly give up my rights for the gospel's sake. Paul could easily make preaching the gospel his full-time gig. But in addition to tirelessly preaching, he will add another full-time manual labor job on top of that. Like, he's an apostle. He is a sent one from the risen King of the universe. He should be able to, like, he could and he does have the right to get money from these people, but he refuses to because the gospel's progress would be at risk. I want to think like that. And most times I don't, if I'm just being honest. I don't think like that. I want to think to myself, I am willing to give this up if it means the gospel goes forward. It is not about my comfort. It's not about your comfort. It's about the gospel's progress. And another reason I think that Paul wouldn't accept payment from them is that he would basically become their employee. When you accept payment from someone, the idea is you're kind of like in their debt. You know, you receive something from them, so it's kind of like they have expectations for you now. They don't own you, but you did receive pay from them, so you're kind of like their employee now. So like, for instance, like, listen, if you work at a Starbucks, let's just say, and I know you guys don't, but let's say one of you works at a Starbucks, you can't just show up at Dunkin' acting like you're an employee there and start making coffee there. You can't do that. You can't do that. You know, you can't just walk in there. Yeah, Jonathan will kick you out. Yes. He'll be like, what's that? Literally kick them out. Yes, you'll just be like, hey, this is, what the heck? This is not Starbucks. Hello, sweet, the most beautiful girl in the world just walked in. Hey, sweetie. I love you. You going to go back to Mama? Or are you going to stay with me? Do you want to stay with me? You want to stay with me? That's okay. Here, I'm going to put a chair next to me, and if she wants to stay by me, I'll sit down. Not stay up the whole time. Is that okay? Do you want me to stay? Oh, do you want to stay with me? Okay. Are those lights too bright? So, what are we talking about? Oh, yeah, Starbucks. Yeah, if you're working at Starbucks, you cannot go into Jonathan's turf and be like, hey, I work here. You don't, friend, and Jonathan will kick you out, and he will kick you out with both legs. Anyway, so here's the thing. Like, no, Paul says this. I want to be financially independent. This is what Paul says. I'm not going to receive money from you because I want to be financially independent. Paul wants to be free of that responsibility to any one person or group that can claim ownership over him. Does that make sense? They write his check. So because they write his check, they probably think, oh, we own you, Paul. And Paul will not let that happen. He will not let anyone say that they own him, that they own a part of him. Does that make sense? But notice something. This is really important, really cool. I don't want you guys to miss this. Paul says this, I want to be free, as in financially independent, so that I can make myself a slave to everyone. That's crazy. Oh my gosh. Paul says, I want to be financially independent so that I could be free to be a slave to every single person. That's crazy. None of us think that way. None of us think that way. Like, I don't think that way, you guys. I don't. We want to be free. We want to be financially independent so that we could be free. We want to be free for freedom's sake. Paul wants to be free so he could be a slave. You guys, none of us think that way. We don't think like, oh, I want to be financially independent so that way I can give as much as I can to every single person. We don't think that way. We don't think like that. I want to think like that. I want to be the kind of person who says, I want to be free. I want to be financially independent of everyone who can have a claim of ownership over me so I can make myself a servant, a slave of everyone. That's what Paul does with his freedom and his independence. He serves everyone, not just the Corinthians. And another reason, this is important, another reason that the Corinthians questioned that Paul was a legit apostle is because they thought that Paul was acting really sus. To use y'all's terminology. They thought Paul was acting sus. They thought, you can't be a real apostle, you're acting really sus. And how was Paul acting sus? Paul told them to not eat meat sacrificed to idols at the temple. But they have seen him eat that same meat sold in the marketplace with other followers of Jesus. And they think that's sus. They think that's so sus. You tell us not to eat the meat in the temple with like pagans, but you're eating the meat with other followers of Jesus in the marketplace. How is that okay? And then when Jewish Christians show up, when they come around, he refrains altogether. He stops eating the meat altogether. Like, what the heck, Paul? They feel like their apostle, they feel like their church planter is being inconsistent. But here's the thing. Paul's not being inconsistent. Paul is being a servant, so that he might win as many people as possible for Jesus. Paul says, to the Jews, I became like a Jew. Paul's saying, when I'm around other Jewish people, I embrace my roots. I eat kosher. I practice Sabbath. I talk about our shared ancestry and our Bible, the Hebrew Bible, what you and I call the Old Testament. And Paul didn't do this. This is really important. Why did Paul be all things to all people? Why did Paul, when he was around Jewish people, act Jewish? This is really important. I don't want you guys to miss this. He did not do it because he was afraid of offending people. If you read about Paul's life, Paul does not care about offending people. That is not like a priority Paul has. He's constantly offending people. But why did he act like Jews around Jewish people? It wasn't because he was afraid of offending them. It was so that he could proclaim the gospel to them, so that the gospel would be heard clearly. Does that make sense? It's not about not offending people, being all things to all people. It's about making sure the gospel is heard clearly. To those under the law, to those under the Torah, he became as one under the law. Not because he had to. He straight up says, I am not under the law. I'm not under the Torah. Living by the commands of the Torah does not put me into God's family. Only allegiance to Jesus puts me into God's family. But when I'm around Torah-observant Jews, I am all in, so that I could win those who are under the law. Yeah, Charlie.
What would he have called?
What would he have called himself?
Like, if they're not the Jews.
Yeah. What's that?
Like the early Christians.
Oh yeah. Oh, he would have said I'm Jewish. Yeah. He would have said I'm a real Jew. because I follow the Messiah. Yeah, he would actually take it a step further. I mean, yeah, he'd probably call himself like a Messianic Jew. Christianity was not a new religion. It was not. It wasn't even called Christianity until like the Gentiles really took it over. But in the early church movement, it was just recognized by outsiders as a sect of Judaism. It was just a separate sect of the same religion, Judaism, because it's not a new religion. It's not a separate religion. It's the fulfillment of ancient Judaism and what God revealed, his revelation to the Jewish people. It's just the fulfillment of that. And we're going to get to this next week in chapter 10 when Paul talks to former pagans. He's talking to Gentiles. He's talking to people who are not Jewish. And he says, your ancestors were with Moses. And you're like, my ancestors, what? Like, I'm not Jewish. And you're saying my ancestors were with Moses. He says exactly. When you are grafted into Jesus, you are grafted into his family tree. You're grafted into the family story. His history, Jesus' family history, is now your family history. So you could call Abraham your father, even though you're not ethnically or biologically Jewish. Does that make sense? It's a spiritual ancestry that you receive through adoption to God's family through union with Jesus, the Son. Does that make sense? So Paul would call himself a Jew. He's a Roman citizen, but he would be recognized as a Jew based on his apparel. But he would gladly say, I'm a Jew who follows the true Messiah, the Christ, who I believe is Yeshua, Jesus. Yeah, that's great. And he would even say in the book of Romans, he says, I am a true Jew. I am one who has been circumcised, not just in my flesh, but in my heart, by the Spirit of God. And the law is written on my heart because I came to believe in Messiah. So yeah, that's a great question. So what does he say? To those who are Jewish, I became like one who is Jewish. To those who are under the law, I became as one under the law. To those who are outside the law, as in Gentiles, people who are not Torah observant, I became as one outside the law. But really important clarification Paul makes. Just because I'm not under the law doesn't mean I'm lawless. That's really important. Paul says, just because I'm not under the law does not mean that I am lawless. It doesn't mean that I could just do whatever I want that's a free-for-all. I'm still under the law of Messiah. I'm still under the Torah of Christ. He is still Lord. I still obey his teachings. Notice in Paul's life. Notice here. When Paul is ministering to these different kinds of people, he never once changes his message. He never changes his message. And he doesn't change his morality either. Does that make sense? Hey, sweetie. How's it going? Are you making music? That's so beautiful. You want to come worship with Calista later? Yeah? You want to be her drummer? Her background drummer? Background singer? Yeah. Wow. But yeah, no, so does that make sense? So Paul says, to those who are under the law, I'm like one under the law. I act Torah observant around them. To those who are outside the law, not under the law, I act as those outside the law. But I still am under a law. I'm still under the law of Jesus. He's still my king. I still obey his teachings. When Paul's ministering to all these different kinds of people, he never changes his message and he never changes his morality. He isn't sinning with them. That's really important. Because I've heard this text taken out of context and being all things to all people doesn't mean that you go get drunk at a bar because you want to win drunkards for Jesus. That is not what that means. Being all things to all people doesn't mean that you go party at the club because you want to win people who live that sort of lifestyle. Yes, Jesus went to tons of parties, but at every party Jesus went to, he called everyone there to repentance. So if you're going to the club, grabbing the mic and just saying, hey, everyone, repent. I'm there. Tell me. I'll come with you. It'll be great. Yes. Being all things to all people does not mean you are sinning with them. Being all things to all people means that you are giving up your rights and your freedoms so that the good news of Jesus can be heard clearly. To the weak, Paul became like one who is weak. He doesn't eat the meat. If the people around Paul think that eating that meat that's been anywhere near pagan sacrifice is a sin, if they think eating that meat that's been around pagans, if they think that sacrificed meat if they think that consuming that meat is a sin, then Paul will gladly not eat it. He will not eat that meat. He could eat it, not at the temple, but he could eat it in general, at home, in private, but he will not do that for the sake of someone else who thinks that it's sin. Being all things to all people is about using every means possible to save even some. Let me just give you a quick example from my own life. This is a really good example from, I just thought of it the other day, how I dress on Sunday mornings when I preach. So this is important. Think of it this way. In Jesus, I am free to wear whatever I want. My clothing is irrelevant. It just needs to be modest. As long as it's modest and not, blatantly promoting idolatry or whatever, as long as my clothing is modest and not promoting idolatry, what I'm wearing is irrelevant. I'm free in Christ to wear whatever I want. However, when I preach first service, I always wear a suit. Or at least a jacket or a tie. And why is that? It is not because I'm afraid of offending people. I don't care. I am definitely offending someone that morning, like by what I say. If you put me up on stage and I'm talking for long enough, I will definitely offend somebody because I'm just preaching the Bible. So I'm going to offend someone that morning. I do not care. I am not scared of offending people. But, why do I wear a suit? Because I want the gospel to come across clearly. The people are used to seeing a preacher in a suit, and I don't want my attire or my attitude or my actions to distract anyone from the gospel. And you might say, because we're young and we're naive and we're honestly kind of stupid, we might say, oh, well, sure, well, that's their problem. That's their problem. And sure, yeah, but what's more important, my rights or the gospel being heard and believed? What are you willing to give up for the gospel to be heard and believed? Yeah, Charlie.
How fast you talk, it only.
What's that?
Says how fast that you talk.
Oh, yes. You're talking about how when I talk on Sunday mornings, I slow myself down a lot so the gospel could be heard clearly and believed. Yeah, no, if I talked at this speed in first service, yeah, no one's getting saved that morning. Yeah, Haley. What's more important, my rights or the gospel being heard and believed? Yeah. And what are you willing to give up for the sake of the gospel to be heard? Paul does everything for the sake of the good news, that he might share with them in its blessing. Like, you guys, I want to see people, I want to see God saving people just as he saved me. I want to be a part of that. I want to get to see that. So Paul here, he ends with a couple metaphors. This is where we're going to end tonight. He ends with a couple metaphors. You don't want to miss this. This is super important. So what does Paul say? If you run a race, this is what Paul's saying. Don't miss this. In a race, all runners run, but only one runner receives the prize. Now, what is Paul talking about? He's using a metaphor from the Isthmian Games. Can you guys say Isthmian Games? Yeah, say it again. You kind of have to say it with a lisp. Isthmian Games. Yes, the Isthmian Games. That sounds silly when you all said it. The Isthmian Games, what is that? It is the second largest sporting event in the ancient world. It is held every 4 years in Corinth. Corinth was actually famous because it was the hosting city for the games, the Isthmian Games. Thousands of people every 4 years attended this game, including Caesar. Caesar came to this. And the main event of the games was the foot race. It was the foot race. You may not know this, but if you like watching the Olympics, the original Olympics was actually just this one giant race. The word race is the Greek word stadium, where we get the word stadium. And it was basically this race where 20 runners would run a 180-meter sprint around a dirt track, and all of them were just running naked. They were all running completely naked. Would you all go to that? I hope. Oh, yeah, Jonathan would. Yes. Yeah. You think spandex is bad, and it is bad, but yeah. So 20 runners running around a dirt track, 180 meters, and they're all naked. Tens of thousands of people, fans, cheering and watching. And Paul says that is what following Jesus is like. It is a race, and in a race, only one gets the prize. So Paul says, so run like a runner going after the prize. This is really important. Paul's point is not that the Christian life is a competition where you're competing with other followers of Jesus. That's not Paul's point. His point is this, and please hear me tonight, this is the most important thing that's going to be said, and I don't want to ruffle feathers here, and I used to not believe this, but I think this is clearly what Paul is teaching here, and I think we all need to hear it. Entry into the race does not mean that you're guaranteed a prize. Just because you enter the race does not mean that you're guaranteed a prize. We need to hear that. Just because you prayed a prayer and walked down an aisle and got baptized, and again, all that was genuine. Like I'm saying you actually genuinely got saved, but just because that happened, it does not mean that on the last day, Jesus is going to look at you and Jesus is going to say to you, well done, my good and faithful servant. Just because you got saved doesn't mean you're going to hear those words from the master's lips. You guys, we're not all going to get the same participation trophy. We are not. That's not how God works. If God was coaching Upward Soccer Saturdays, that is not how it works. We are not all going to get the same participation trophy. In the new creation, and please hear me, in the new creation, we will all have the same standing before God because of what Jesus did. We will all have equal value, but we will not all have equal reward. We are not all going to have the same reward. That's Paul's point. We are in a race. And some of y'all, Paul says, you guys aren't running. You're not really running. Like some of y'all, and some of you are running, but you're running in all these different directions. You're running aimlessly. To be an athlete requires discipline. It's not just natural ability. You can have all the natural ability in the world, but you still need to train if you want to win the race. And that's the same. That's true with following Jesus. You cannot, please hear this, you cannot be a disciple without discipline. And those English words, same root. Like, you cannot be a disciple of Jesus without discipline. You can't. This requires focus, eyes on the prize. Athletes in Paul's day, if they wanted to compete in the Isthmian Games or the Olympics, they would have to train every day for 10 months. And failure to show up to even one day of training would mean disqualification from playing in the games. Paul says we need to have that same level of focus and determination and discipline if we want to follow Jesus. And yes, the Spirit provides the growth. Yes, you cannot grow yourself. I cannot grow myself. The Spirit will grow us. But you do have a role to play in your growth. And it is not a passive role. Your role is not passive. It's not let go and let God. The Bible nowhere teaches that. These athletes train vigorously for many months. And for what? You know what they train for? Pine leaves. Pine leaves woven together into a crown. One that Elizabeth could probably make one way better than the ones that they handed out. That's what they train for. All this training and all this time and energy and effort and all this running, what is it all for? It is for pine leaves woven together into a crown, a laurel wreath that will break apart and fade away. But the race that you and I run, follower of Jesus, you know what we're going to get at the end of it? An imperishable crown, a crown that will never fade away. Now, what's that referring to? What is that referring to? I get this question a lot about rewards in the new creation because it's very clear in the New Testament that we get rewards. What is that actually talking about? So in the New Testament, reward is described in two ways. The first is praise from the master. You see that in 1 Corinthians chapter 4. We read that a few weeks ago. Well done, my good and faithful servant. Hearing those words from the lips of Jesus is your reward. But the second reward is more responsibility in the kingdom. It is not, I don't know what you've been told. It's not mansions or cars or dogs. I don't know what you think your reward should be. You know, I've heard some people say, oh yeah, Jesus, I'm going to serve him all my life, and then when I get to new creation, he's going to give me like 20 dogs. I'm like, okay, maybe, I don't know. Like, whatever you think your reward should be, it's not that. Your reward for work, your reward for your work is even more work. That's the reward for your work, even more work. And remember, this is important. It's not begrudging submission or blood, sweat, and tears. When you are working for Jesus, that is worship. And for all eternity in the new creation, the reward for your work is going to be even more work. And when I say work, I mean work for Jesus, which is worship. The one, Jesus says, who is faithful with little will be faithful with much. And I want him to say that of me. And here's another thing. Working for the king is serving other people. Working for the king is worshiping the king, but it's also serving other people. Because remember, this is not a competition. The race that we run is not a competition. For Paul, to finish the race involves him helping other people get to the finish line. It is not a competition. It's not you tripping up the competition so they can't get to the finish line. Winning the race for y'all means helping each other get to the finish line. And while, yes, it's true, though, some of y'all, Jesus says, will rule over 10 cities. Some of you will rule over 5 cities. And some of you will rule over none. And I hope that's not me. But some of you will rule over none. But here's the thing. Who benefits from that? Who benefits from you ruling over their city? The people in that city. It's not just that God hooks you up just to hook you up. No, that whoever dwells in those cities gets to benefit from you ruling over them. Your reward for serving the king and his people is that you will get to serve the king and his people in new creation. That is your reward. For serving the king and his people, you get to serve the king and his people in the new creation. There's a guy, he's in our married ministry, and he does maintenance, and he does plumbing. That's his vocation. But his passion is cooking. That's his passion. And I already know what his reward's going to be. I know because I've received a revelation. God has told me. He's going to get a taco truck, like hands down, like no doubt. Like he's going to get a taco truck. And you know what he's going to do in new creation? He is not going to have that taco truck all to himself. He's going to be making tacos for other people. And that will be his reward. That's his reward. Oh, yes, I'm sure he can. Washed in the blood. Yeah, so here's the thing. And we need to hear this. Paul's point is that there is a prize at the end of this, but we aren't guaranteed to attain it just because we entered the race. We have to run. And don't run aimlessly with no sense of direction or purpose. My daughter's running with direction and purpose right now. She's running right towards me. Like she's running towards me. Run like that towards Jesus. I know when I had long hair, I kind of look like Jesus. This would be a perfect metaphor if I still had longer hair. But anyway, so run, and don't run aimlessly. Don't run with no sense of direction or purpose. You guys, we are running towards something. We are specifically running towards someone. It's a person with a name, and his name is Jesus. Don't beat the air and confuse that with boxing. That's not boxing. Another metaphor from the games, from the Isthmian games. Running was considered glorious and honorable, but boxing, that was like one of the lower games. Like if you won in the boxing round, like they would look at you all bloody and bruised and be like, oh, well, I guess you're an Olympian, I guess. It was one of the lower games. But that's what following Jesus is like. It's a fight. So don't step into the ring and just punch the air. Your punches won't land. You need to be disciplined. You need to have self-control. You need to be able to resist and reject everything that is not good for you and not good for others. Because in this fight, you are not fighting with another person. You are fighting with yourself. You need to hear that tonight. You guys, we are in a fight, and who are you fighting with? You are not fighting with other people. You are fighting with you. And when I say you're fighting with you, what I don't mean is like you're fighting with your true self. You're fighting with your flesh. You are fighting with your sin nature. You are fighting with the part of you that is bent towards disobedience, bent towards redefining good and evil for yourself. The part of you that wants to be God, that is the part you are fighting with yourself. Because here's the thing, your strongest desires, and your strongest desires at any minute could be sinful desires. I don't know what your strongest desire in any given moment could be a sinful desire. Your strongest desires are always constantly in conflict with your deepest desires, which I believe are godly and from the Spirit of God. If you're a follower of Jesus, your deepest desires are good and godly desires. And your deepest desires are in war with your strongest desires. Does that make sense? That's the fight. Your strongest desires versus your deepest ones. You are constantly fighting. And you guys, listen, Paul is being really serious here. Because you guys, when this hit me, I remember I read this week, and I just started weeping because I realized what he was saying. What's the risk here? The risk, if you don't have self-control, if you don't run the race, the risk is not that you run off track. The risk is not that you lose the race. The risk is you're disqualified from the prize. That's the risk. It's not just running off track. It's not just losing the race. It's that you're disqualified from the prize. I don't want that to happen to me. I don't want that to happen to any of you. And Paul was afraid, apparently, that was going to happen to him. We must maintain focus on Jesus. As the author of Hebrews says, run the race with your eyes looking to Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith. He is the goal, he is the way, he is the path, and he is the finish line. Now, if you don't remember, we talked about this earlier in the series. Paul wrote 1 Corinthians pretty early. It's one of the first letters that Paul ever wrote. One of the last letters that Paul ever wrote is 2 Timothy. And one of the last things that Paul writes as he is getting ready in just a few days to be executed, beheaded by the emperor, one of the last things that Paul says, that one of the last things he ever writes is this. He says, I have fought the good fight. I have kept the faith. I have finished the race. He says, I did it. I did it. And here's the thing, at the end of my life, when my lungs are about to cave in and I'm about to see Jesus face to face, I want to be able to say that I have fought the good fight, I have finished the race, I have kept the faith. Paul says, I was not disqualified. I thought I might have been, like many years ago when I wrote 1 Corinthians, I thought there's a chance I might be disqualified, but I was not disqualified. I did it. I made it to the end. I made it to the finish line, and I was not disqualified from the prize. And you guys, if we are ever going to get there, it's going to take focus. It's going to take running with a clear, I know, it's funny because you're trying to focus right now. I know, it's hard for me too because she's so cute. It's literally the greatest noise in the entire universe. 2 Corinthians, Paul, this is so funny, 2 Corinthians the Apostle Paul, he got caught up, it says, to the third heaven. He got caught up into the presence of Jesus, into God's throne room, it says, in the heavenly temple. And it doesn't talk about what he saw, but he says, I can't even tell you the sounds I heard. They were so beautiful. The sounds I heard were so beautiful. And I imagine that's the sound I'm hearing. When I see Jesus face to face, like the most beautiful sound I could ever hear, like is definitely that sound. So here's the point. Here's the point. If we're ever going to get there, if we're ever going to get to the point that Paul got at the end of his life where he said, I fought the good fight, I finished the race, I've kept the faith. If we're ever going to get there, it's going to take focus. It's going to take running with a clear goal. Aim for that. Don't run aimless or sporadically. The author of Hebrews says, throw off every weight. And what does that mean? Good or bad thing. It doesn't have to be a sinful thing. It could be anything. Anything. Everything that distracts you or holds you back or slows you down, throw it all behind you. It is going to take, if you're going to get to the end and be able to say what Paul said, it's going to take you making everything about the gospel. Making everything about the calling, the unique calling that God has placed on your life, the unique way that you fit into God's purpose of reuniting heaven and earth. You are to find out your calling and then say yes to that every single day and no to every weight. It doesn't have to be a sinful thing you're saying no to. You have to say, you're going to learn this real quick. You have to say yes to the best things. But in order to do that, you have to say no to good things. If you want to say yes to the best things, you have to say no to good things every single day. It's going to take, if we're ever going to get there, it's going to take, if we want to get to the end, not be disqualified from the prize, it's going to take really hard work. It's going to take strict training. That is what apprenticeship to Jesus looks like. If you want the life of Jesus, you need to adopt his lifestyle. Godliness is not natural. It's not natural to you and I. It's not. It's going to take self-discipline, having control over your natural urges and cravings. And maybe for you tonight, maybe that's going to start with you guys setting an alarm 30 minutes early every morning so you could spend time with God. Maybe that's the next step for you. Maybe it's going to start with you going a day a week without eating any food until sunset. That's called fasting. Maybe that's the next step for you. And listen, you don't change yourself. I don't grow self-control in me. Self-control is the fruit of the Spirit. Self-control is produced in me by the Spirit, not by me. But that is how you make room for the Spirit to grow self-control in you. I don't make myself self-controlled. The Spirit does. But I have to make room for him to do that. It's going to take endurance. It's going to take focus, discipline, self-determination. It's going to take endurance. Because you guys, this race, it is not just a season of your life. This is your life. And the finish line is when you get to the end. Keep running. And please, don't give your life for pine leaves. Because some of us, if we're honest, we're doing that. We are chasing after things that are not going to last, instead of chasing after what's going to last forever. Don't chase after things that are going to fade away. They will fade away. Don't live your life for pine leaves. Those are going to fade away. Chase after that which is going to last. Because here's the thing, I want to gain the prize. I want all of you to gain the prize. So let's fight the good fight. Let's finish the race by God's grace. Let's keep the faith until we get to the finish line, until we see Jesus face to face. Let's pray briefly before we worship and go to small groups. Father, thank you so much for this evening. God, I thank you for this challenging, convicting passage that I read this week, and I was just so, it bothered me, God, in all the right ways. I pray, God, that we would be people who be all things to all people, genuinely. We're so obsessed with our rights. We're so obsessed with what we can and can't do with our freedoms. But your servant Paul, when he was free, the moment he was free, he used all that freedom to become a slave to everyone else. Help us, God. Help me be all things to all people. Whatever that means, whatever that looks like in my life might look different. It might look like putting on a suit on Sunday mornings when I'm preaching, even though it's hot up on stage and the light's on me. It doesn't matter. Whatever it could be simple. Like, just help me be all things to all people. Not because I'm afraid of offending them, but because I want them to be able to hear the gospel clearly and believe it. I want to do everything, God, for the progress of the gospel. That is what my life is about. Everything I do, everything I endure is for the sake of the gospel moving forward and being heard and believed. May that be true of all of our lives. God, entry into the race does not mean that we are guaranteed a prize. I think many of us, I know I grew up when I was 15 onward, and I believed in Jesus. I kind of just assumed that. I kind of just assumed like, oh yeah, everyone is going to hear those words, well done, my good and faithful servant. That's not true. Just because you're a child of God, just because you're a follower of Jesus does not mean that the master will look at you and say those words. I hope he does. I hope he says that to every single person in this room. I hope he says that to me. I know if it was just based on today, he would not say that to me. He would not say that to me. So Lord, may we make our life about gaining the prize. And our reward, Jesus, is you. Our reward is praise from the master. Our reward has a proper name, and that name is Jesus. You are our prize. And our reward is serving you. Our reward is working for you. My reward for the rest of my life, my existence, I pray, is that I get to serve you even more. I pray that you look at me on that day, Jesus, and look at every single person in this room, and you say to them, you were faithful with little. Now you get to be faithful with much. Come enter into your master's happiness, into the kingdom I've prepared for you. And you rule over these 10 cities. You rule over these 5. And Lord, I just pray that as we run this race, that we would actually run. Some of us aren't running. Or if we are running, we're running in all the different directions. We're running aimlessly, sporadically. We're running towards all these things that aren't you, Jesus. We're running towards, and I'm not saying these things are sinful, but something doesn't have to be sinful for it to be stupid. Making your life about something that's not going to last, it's just dumb. It's dumb, and we do it. It's not necessarily sinful, but it's stupid. It holds us back. You have something good for us, God. Help us make our lives about that. Help us to run towards you, Jesus, with discipline and focus and determination. because that is what it's all about. It's about running after. When we are running after the prize, we're running after a person. We're running after you, Jesus. And I pray we would do that with disciplined focus, because there is so many things warring against us. The enemy is doing everything he can to constantly try to distract us. If the devil can't make you bad, he'll make you busy. He'll do everything he can to keep you from Jesus, to keep you from his word, to keep you from his people. That's just how he works. He's doing everything he can to distract us and keep us from you, Lord. So I pray that you would give us focus, determination, self-discipline, self-control, endurance, hope. Help us run the race that is set before us and look to Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith. I will not get to the end of this race without you running by my side, Lord. So please run by my side. And help me help others in this race. Help them get to the finish line. May I make my life about that. There is a prize waiting for us, and I want every single person in this room, myself included, to gain the prize. I want to hear, well done, my good and faithful servant. We love you, Lord, and I just pray as we worship you now through song and then go into small groups and talk about these things with other brothers and other sisters, that you will, again, bring clarity to us. The Spirit of God, you are the one that gives wisdom, not Billy Cronin. The Spirit gives wisdom, and he lives inside every single person in this room. So continue to give us wisdom now, God, as we continue to talk about these things. We love you. It's in your beautiful name we pray. Amen.